Once again, Riot dropped a massive patch shaking up the 15.3 TFT meta. Some things didn't change very much, like Udyr and Yuumi being a little bit too strong, but a ton of new compositions and variants have now surfaced that have completely upended the tier list. And with the recent tournament finishing, all the pros have revealed their full tech, and we have now downloaded all the knowledge. Let's go ahead and jump into the TFT Academy tier list and find out what is that tech, and how do we play it. The number one composition currently in the game is Battle Academia Prodigy Yuumi. Most people understand this build by now. You play 5 Battle Academia and 5 Prodigy, and you prioritize an Archangels on Yuumi as your first item because your whole goal is to just stall for Yuumi as long as it takes. The reason why it's so good is because if you just have Yuumi 1, you're still really stable for all of stage 4, which is some of the most crucial fights in the game. As long as you have an upgraded frontline of either K'Sante 2 or Leona 2, you should be very competitive for a lot of fights. And the best case scenario, if you upgrade Yuumi 2 and you hit either Leona 2 or K'Sante 2, that means you can get to level 9 and play for 5 Prodigy. 5 Prodigy is an important breakpoint because all of a sudden your Prodigy abilities can start healing your tank, which is really important for sustain. But don't be fooled into playing 5 Prodigy on level 8 unless you have something like a Prodigy emblem or you hit Isekai with Prodigy for the Echo. The other thing about this composition is you really just want to itemize your front line. It's really important to get 2 sets of tanks and stall out for Yuumi as much as possible. So you don't actually care that much about prioritizing something like a Malzahar secondary carry. Just give him anti-heal like Morello, Red Buff, and Void Staff, and just let him AoE things down over time just with his Insidious Whispers, and just let Yuumi machine gun everything down over time. A really common opener that you play for is around Prodigy for Syndra and Ezreal, and you play Rel Garen. This is the best core to play around for pretty much every AP line in the game, but for Prodigies especially. And we have Gunblade here as an example slam, but you can totally just slam Jewel Gauntlet as well, totally fine. A couple other things worth noting, Mana Zane is extremely powerful Yuumi and definitely her best artifact. You can also play something like Zhonya's Paradox on her, which is also good. Garen is also really good with Innervane Locket. You can actually have him be the primary tank, and you don't even need 3-star Garen. If you put Innervane Locket on this Garen, give him supporting tank items, and just have him be the main tank for a while until you get Leona and K'Sante, that's also good enough. The number one power-up you're going to be looking for Yuumi is Bullet Hell. Another one that people really like is Super Genius on Yuumi, but I think you're only supposed to go for Super Genius if you end up getting a lot of tiers. Because you have Prodigy giving you mana, you actually don't really want so much mana gain onto Yuumi because she already has so much of it. That's why we're building no tiers on her. But if you end up getting a situation where you have to make adaptive, you have to make blue buff, you have just too many tiers, and you hit Yuumi, just go for Super Genius so you can get that Archangels-like effect on her. And then pretty much just take any of the usual tank stuff. If you go for K'Sante, you can pretty much take something similar to him as we have listed here for Leona. Take a lot of item augments because it's going to be difficult to get 2 full tank sets plus Yuumi plus utility. And of course, if you hit Seraphine as your top end, she's a lot better now. You can also put Seraphine with items as well in the late game to close it out. Composition number 2 that you need to know is Duelist Ashe, featuring Colossal Udyr as your front line. If you played any of this patch or the last patch, you already are deeply familiar with this build. You play 6 Duelist and you play Colossal Udyr. Udyr takes 2 slots, so you pretty much just play a very straightforward 6 Duelist plus set, and you are very stable just with 2-star Udyr and 1-star Ashe. Colossal Udyr is really important to have 6 Duelists because Duelist gets 12% damage reduction. That combined with best in slot Udyr just makes him really, really hard to kill. It's a little bit counterintuitive if you haven't seen this before because you might be thinking, oh, don't I just play real tank items like Stoneplate and Bramble and Warmogs? But Udyr, with the fighter items, really capitalizes on his ability synergizing with these items and the fact that he's a Colossus. Because, for example, if you have Steris Cage and you have a shield worth the certain maximum HP, you have a lot more HP thanks to the Colossus because you have 1,000 more and you get 20% durability. That just makes Udyr very, very difficult to kill and partially what allows Ashe to ramp up things like the Kraken's Fury and her Rage Blade. Third item for Ashe now has gravitated towards Edge of Night because the meta has become so much about ramp, and then burst. The Edge of Night keeps her alive and allows her to get 1 extra round of casting, which can be really huge. Your duo carry ideally late game is Lee Sin, so you want to go for Infinity Edge, Hand of Justice, and an Edge of Night, but you pretty much give him whatever's left over. In fact, what ends up happening a lot is you might even slam things like Lee Sin items on other units. Like if you get Ashe and you have Rage Blade, Infinity Edge, and Kraken, that's totally fine, and you move Infinity Edge later onto Lee Sin. Tear and Glove are the worst components in this composition, so sometimes you have to slam a Hand of Justice. Just put that on Udyr and have it move to Lee Sin later on. That's all totally okay. Another really unsung hero of this composition is Kayle. Kayle at level 9 with 6 duels actually can generate a pretty good amount of damage. And if you give her something like Morel Namicon or the red buff, she can also do a lot of work. So it's just options. You don't have to put Sunfire in set. You don't have to put the Morello on Kayle. It's just things that you could do for the composition. They did nerf bullet hell this patch, so it's not nearly as good. In fact, I would say that Ashe can use a wide variety of power-ups that are pretty fine. I think Shadow Clone's a lot worse, so maybe try to avoid Shadow Clone right now, but some people still pick it. But the big thing is that at the very top end, you put second Colossal on Lee Sin. There are 2 Colossals that you can get, and you can power up both of them. You can power up both the Udyr and the Lee Sin, but you only do that at level 9, and you need Lee Sin too, because otherwise you're going to lose another team slot, and you're not going to be able to play 6 duelists, or you have to lose Juggernaut. Flicker Blades and Fishbones are 2 of the best artifacts for Ashe, but you also could play a handful of other artifacts if it makes sense, so just look up any stats that make sense for it. Another couple artifacts you want to think about with Ashe are Flicker Blades and Fishbones. I personally think Fishbones is stronger than Flicker Blades, but I also think both are really good and exceptional, so it doesn't really matter. The other thing too about this composition that we're starting to become more important with the item priority is that it's more important to try and prioritize getting like the Udyr items first and then just giving Ashe like leftover. Like, yes, you do want things like Rageblade Kraken, but getting something like the Stone Plate and a Stairs Gauge for Udyr can also be really important as well. Because if Udyr dies, your team dies. Because Ashe is pretty much only as good as the front line. And that is why Ashe 1 and even going back to Yuumi 1 are so good, because their front lines can hold for so long. The longer your front line holds, the more you ram. Fast 9 Varus is probably the overall strongest comp in the game. It's really hard to get to, but if you can play this board around Varus and just a ton of synergies, it ends up blowing up pretty much everything in the game. Varus is really well positioned in the meta because he's the best 2-star 5 cost at just dealing with enemy backline. He'll just fire 5 arrows at random enemies, and then that just ends up killing a lot of backline. It doesn't matter if they have Ashe 2, it doesn't matter if they have Edge of Night, it doesn't matter if they have Yuumi 2, you will just kill everything. And then you also just have the pure value. If you have Twisted Fate with items, you have Braum with items, Cassante with items, Xayah with items, it's just too much. And to tag it all in, you have Crystal Gambit to help feed you extra resources every couple of fights. Twisted Fate's best in slot tends to just be the utility items, like things like Morello Namicon, Rageblade, Attack Speed, Red Buff, Last Whisper. You could put Kraken on him as well, but it's not that important. What's really important is that you just get to 9, you just slam all your items, and you make sense of it later on. Varus does want things like sword-based items, though. Spear of Shojin, Deathblade, Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer. He wants all of that in order to close it out and kill his opponent. Cassante is the most important tank in this composition, but sometimes you're going to itemize Braum as well, so just kind of depends on what you're able to get. And as you can see, the bunch of augments I recommend are just an infinite amount of econ augments, because you really, really want to hit your board. But I will say that even though you can take a lot of econ augments, items are important as well. It doesn't matter if you have Varus 2, Braum 2, Twisted Fate 2. If you don't have items on any of them, it doesn't really make much sense. So try not to just get too deep into the hole and just take econ. You do need a mixture of items. And the best combat augment, we don't even have listed here because we want to emphasize all the econ. I think the best combat that you can take is Bronze for Life, because this just plays something silly like 8 traits that are overlapping, and you have a bunch of Bronze for Life value. In terms of power-ups, I think Varus with Shadow Clone still is pretty good, but you honestly can't really go wrong with just anything that does a bunch of damage. They buffed Bludgeoner, for example, and I think that it's like better now, even though it might seem like not that much. It's just, it actually ends up killing tanks even quicker, and Varus can burst backline really heavily. The opener that feels good with this is when you can play Gnar 2-star and get something like Golden Edge or Midas Touch on him, so you can just rack up a bunch of gold. Or you just have other ways to generate gold, like the Shimmer Scale Essence. This is also like one of the signals to go Fast 9 on top of all the other econ augments that you can get. The last of like the big 3 in terms of 4-cost level 8 compositions is Star Guardian Jinx. They buffed Jinx a lot. They buffed Star Guardians. They nerfed specifically Syndra, so Syndra is not going to be as big of a part of the composition. But overall, Star Guardians are very solid. They remind me a lot of Vanguard Marksman from the previous set, where your win rate's not going to be super high, but your top 4 rate is very, very consistent as long as you play the line well. The thing to understand about Star Guardians is that it's a team effort comp. You're not actually trying to just like hyper carry a specific unit. Unlike Yuumi and Ashe, who are trying to basically solo carry their team all the way to 9, you oftentimes really care about RE2. You actually do care about Xayah 2, and you care about, like, even if you have Jinx 1 and you have all that mentioned, just the team-based damage that can be generated is actually a lot and adds up over time. So don't feel like if you roll down, you have to just all in on Jinx 2, Poppy 2, and that's just going to be your game. It's really about the quality of your team overall. And that's why this is a composition where it can use a lot of items, because if you just give Jinx attack speed and AD items, you give Xayah utility and attack speed items, Ahri takes AP, and you itemize, tank stuff on Nico and Poppy. You just have a lot of items, just gives the Star Guardians a ton of value. And you'd be surprised how much that team effort can kick in. That's also why quality for quantity ends up being a pretty good augment for this line as well, because this is really good when you have big team buffs, and this is one of them. One artifact to look out for is Luden's Tempest. If you get Luden's Tempest on Ahri and you just give her, the Shojin and the mana stuff to cast, she actually does a ton of damage. And they buffed Ahri 3, so if you end up getting Ahri 3, it's also a pretty good win con. One power-up that's really done a lot for Star Guardians lately is Sky Piercer on Jinx. And that's because it just saves you the headache of trying to worry about having both Sunder and Shred. Like, we have Sky Piercer here and, Spark as an example, but that's just like, you just give Poppy like whatever leftover tank items and you can just get it done. And you hopefully go for Sky Piercer to provide you that Sunder and Shred. So if you have this, don't build Spark, don't build Voice Staff, don't build Last Whisper or even Shroud. Just have Sky Piercer on Jinx to add utility for the whole team. So this one I think is the best overall. But if you can't get this, then maybe just pick something else that just makes sense for Jinx. Unstoppable is Poppy's most common one because it just has a really good synergy for Poppy to get to the back line and disrupt and maybe even stun the opposing carry. But I think one that's really underrated is Best Defense. I think this one is reliable if you have something like a Stairs Gauge on Poppy. So just keep an eye out for that. Best Defense, low-key, can actually do a ton of damage, especially with a really good Star Guardian setup. And of course, if you do get a Star Guardian emblem, put it on Kabuko. Kabuko ends up being a really good heavyweight to time with Poppy, but you can also put it on Braum on some of your top end, or, some people, we had Gwen here, but I think you can also play Varus to tie in with the Jinx. It's all really viable, and Star Guardian has a lot of flexibility with who their 9th unit can be. Crew got a pretty big makeover. The current best build doesn't actually play around vertical crew and 3-starring everything. Like, you're not trying to go for Shen and Ziggs 3. Instead, you play for Malphite and Sivir, and then you play more protectors and snipers. So it's actually more accurate to call this a protector sniper reroll as opposed to necessarily crew. But a lot of people know this to be part of the crew opener because you're really opening around Malphite, and then Sivir just holds items for Jhin or Jinx. And the reason why this is really powerful is because you're utilizing the fact that crew gives you free EXP per reroll, which gives you a lot of reason just to roll at lower levels and pick up things like Jhin 3 and Kennen 3. It's actually quite solid in a composition that can scale into the late game. And the most important thing is that it wins a lot of crucial mid-game fights. I will say that this composition is kind of dependent on hitting K'Sante for a secondary tank because Malphite is really good for a big portion of the game, but you do need a secondary layer of tankiness, and K'Sante can definitely do that. And then for the backline, after you itemize Jhin, you either go for Jinx or you go for Varus as your top end. Jinx is just a lot easier to hit than Varus, but Star Guardians are pretty contested, so if you can't hit Jinx, don't even worry about it. And you can also play different offshoot variations as well. I have seen people play Gnar with like these Jinx items. I played Gnar carry as well, like Gnar Jhin, and then find my way to Varus. That's also possible. It's totally fine to just play into that and then try to play for a top 4 that way. But I do think this variation is really strong. So if you get any kind of good reroll synergy, hefty rolls, prismatic ticket, or you get like the Shimmer Skill Essence Mogul's Mail, that's also really good for Malphite. And I also want to give a shout out to Intervening Locket on Malphite. That artifact is insane. But please don't confuse this as something that you go for Sivir. The reason why we have Sivir, we're like, why you call it a Malphite comp if you have Sivir as the icon, is because just the way our tier list is categorized. If we put Malphite as the icon here, it would remove this, and then put like the Malphite here instead and tuck this X behind it. So just for organizational purposes, because Sivir's part of every comp, we just have her icon here. It is a Malphite comp. Kai'Sa reroll is still really strong. It is the best snowballing reroll comp in the game, and it's one of those compositions where if it snowballs early, it can actually just like continue to snowball for the rest of the game and end the game at really high HP. It's also a composition that can make a big comeback as well. We found a pretty high cap version of Kai'Sa that can compete with some of the best comps. And I mean, if you hit Rammus 3, Darius 3, you can beat all of the other comps in front of it. Maybe even the Varus comp if you get like some artifacts like Fishbones. We've seen some Kai'Sa make some really, really big comebacks in tournaments. So if you open up a Kai'Sa early and you have Sword, definitely consider thinking about Kai'Sa. The big limiting factor about this specific variation where you play around Rammus is that, one, it might take a while to get Rammus to level 15. Level 15 is when Rammus becomes a real problem because he ends up actually casting and jumping in as opposed to just shielding. But two, it's also really, really expensive. And so what ends up happening a lot of times is when you're rolling for Kai'Sa and you just cannot find Rammus, you find like a Rise, people instead just play for Mentor and they just itemize, Kai'Sa and the Mentors instead. That's a cheaper version than just going for, Xayah plus 2 3-star 3 cost. You can also see that sometimes you itemize a Kali. That's just completely dependent on your leftover items. Like, we should probably update this version too to just show that you play 3-star Darius in a lot of these variations. I think 3-star Darius is quite solid in 4 Supreme cells. But if you aren't getting the AD items, you're not getting the extra swords because it's hard to get, Shojin, i.e. Flail, and then 2 more sword items for Darius. If you just get a bunch of AP stuff, just put it on a Kali, and a Kali can also get some stuff done. You're just looking for secondary carry. So either of these variations are pretty good. Xayah is very, very solid. If you also don't have Shojin, you can just go for Rage Blade on her. That's totally okay. The best power up to think about for Xayah is over 9,000, but you also can think about max attack. Attack Expert's also really good. And then, of course, Gather Force if you have a bunch of extra mana cast and you just don't have, like, the AD. You do really care about Infinity Edge, though, so make sure you always have that for her. The biggest buffs of the patch was to Senna and this Mentor Executioner reroll line. This line is really, really powerful, and you can play it in 2 different ways. One, you can just choose to reroll for Senna Yasuo and try to, like, stay on 7 and go for it. But I prefer to play this as a fast 8 composition. You go to level 8 and you look for Rise 2, because Rise 2 Senna 2 is quite stable, and if you can get to level 9, you actually can just win the game that way. The difficulty of this composition is that it's fairly expensive to get online. You need to hit Rise 2 and Jarvan 2, and you also kind of want to hit the Mentors, which can be pretty pricey. And you also want items for everyone too. So you want to itemize Rise, Senna, and you want to itemize Yasuo, because these mentors, I mean, if you're playing a 4 mentor comp, you just want to put items on the mentors. The fun thing about this composition is that you don't have to make tank items. You can just like use the fact that you have an extra mech and you have a bunch of utility and stuns from all of the mentors. That ends up being pretty solid. So you don't have to actually make that many tank items. Maybe just, some utility for Jarvan, that's it. This Lee Sin slot is pretty flexible on 8. A lot of times people play a Kali, but you can flex in whoever you want. If you hit Yone, if you hit Xayah, if you hit Twisted Fate, or if you just hit like a random Cassante 2, that's also totally fine. Just slot it in. But I believe the highest cap is an itemized Lee Sin 2. You also have flexibility with who you fruit as well. You can fruit Senna, Yasuo, or Rise. Just itemize and fruit whoever you are most likely to get some damage with. That's pretty much it. I would not want to itemize, for example, Senna with 1 star and like 2 items. I'd rather go for 2-star Yasuo, or if I have a 1-star Rise with 1 or 2 items, I wouldn't fruit him either. Efficient, and I really like precision. Some people do play Shadow Clone still. I think it's a lot weaker, but it's popular, so we're going to include it here. And then for Rise, I think Icebender is the most popular, but I actually think Rise is really flexible. Just choose whatever makes most sense based on your items. Because the thing about this composition is that you should just slam and play your items. You don't need to have best in slot across the board. Rise can use Archangel Staff and Void Staff, which is really nice because Archangels ties into Yuumi. So you can slam Archangels and be open to Rise and Yuumi. But if you get like Archangels, Death Cap, and Jewel Gauntlet, that's totally fine on Rise. And then find a way to play around Shred, like get, Sky Piercer on Rise, for example, and have him pierce for himself. That's totally fine. As long as you just slam your items, get the Rise too. Best in slot is like pretty fake for this comp. Just tempo, play from ahead. And that's because you really want to get to level 9 for this comp. If you're stuck on 8, rolling for Rise 2, Senna 2, that's pretty much how you bought 4. I made a whole YouTube video walking through how Robin Songs played a pretty straightforward foundational approach to Senna Rise. So check that out if you want to see some actual in-depth walkthrough and VOD review. Protector Kog'Maw has some pretty impressive stats this patch. It's not doing too hot in tournament, but that's because I think a lot of people are trying to play Kog'Maw without an artifact. I'm pretty sure Kog'Maw with artifacts is just busted, and he has so many that are good with him. Thicker Blades and Dawn Core, I think, are the 2 best, but if Static Shiv is good, Wit's End is good, Zhonya's is good. I've seen people play Lichbane Kog'Maw. That's also okay. He's just really, really powerful with a wide arrangement of artifacts. So anytime you're opening a Portable Forge and you have a Lulu, definitely be thinking about Kog'Maw. Kog'Maw's other best in slot is Shojin and Archangels. Usually the artifact replaces 1 Shojin just to help him, get the cast going. But you definitely want an Archangels as a ramp source and the Shojin just to help him with casting more often. Because the thing about his cast is that he gets more attack speed and that ramps his other cast to get more attack speed. So it's a very important recursive loop for him to just get stronger and stronger as the fight goes on. The front line for Kog'Maw is pretty flexible. You don't have to go for Nico 3. This is just an example because you're rolling for 3 costs on level 7. So if you go for Nico 3, that's great. But if it's contested, you can go for Rakan 3. You can also just go for Cassante 2 as your primary tank, and that's it. Janna is also your secondary carry in a lot of the situations. If you end up going for a 3-star Janna, give her things like Archangels and Rageblade and Utility. That's also really solid. It's important to note that Kog'Maw also provides anti-armor and anti-magic resistance. He shreds for himself, so don't need to actually build shred items. On 8, you want to play a strategist or a 5-cost. I think we have some generic 5-costs here. This is actually a little bit outdated, so it reminded me to change this after this video. But you actually need to play like a strategist because that ties in with Janna. So a lot of times people play Jarvan or Cassante, which also happens to be really good if you have a Protector Emblem. Just put that Protector Emblem on Jarvan. The power-ups is where Kog'Maw is truly shining. I think 2 of them that are debated in particular are Caretaker, which is really good because you cast, you shield an ally for 6 seconds, and that scales to their AP. Not to mention that protectors get durability while shielded, so there's a lot of synergy there between his ability and how he's fighting. But there's another one called Fairy Tail, which got buffed, which on cast spawns 2 fairies that stay during the fight. So he's just going to summon more and more fairies that deal more and more damage. And you have this really cool visual of Kog'Maw surrounded by fairies, just dealing a ton of small trickle damage. Unfortunately, I think this one tends to get hard countered by certain aspects of things. Like if people have a Dragon's Claw and a Resistant on their tank, Fairy Tail kind of runs into some problems. But it's really, really strong when you have something like Dawn Core. So just, try it out. The whole point is we're still in the experimental phase. It's early in the patch. Maybe there's other versions of Kog'Maw that's going to innovate and we'll update the tier list. But this is a pretty strong reroll comp. Try to play some Kog'Maw Protector Trainer. It's very, very solid. I would say the latest that you could get Kog'Maw would probably be before Stage 2 Carousel. I think after Stage 2 Carousel, it just takes a really long time for him to get to level 15 and 30. You really care about level 15 and 30. Those are huge upgrades for Kog'Maw. And once he hits level 30, he will be in a much better position to carry, and that infinite rage goes really hard on top of the attack speed bonuses. Last but not least, Crystal Gambit is still very good if you get the Crystal Gambit spot. It's rare, right? You're not really going to be playing this very often. It's really dependent on you having a Crystal Gambit emblem. It's like coin flipping to hit Xayah on 8. But if you hit 7 Crystal Gambit, it is really powerful. But you have to remember one important thing. It's not really about hyper greeting for like a crazy reward. Crystal Gambit is actually a win streak composition. The reason it's strong is because you get a 7 Crystal, you hit Ashe 2, you win streak on stage 3 and 4 with 5 or 7 Crystal Gambit, and you cash out the rewards. That's what matters. If you're able to cash out rewards, you end up getting a ton of value over time, and then you just outvalue everything and you go infinite. If you try to play Crystal Gambit without the emblem, you're just going to fail. It falls off really hard because you just get so little value off of things like Syndra and Janna, even if you hit the board. So try not to play this unless you absolutely know that you can hit 7 Crystal. Outside of that, though, pretty much just a straightforward Ashe front to back composition, and you dual carry Xayah. Another good unit to play is Twisted Fate. One thing about Crystal Gambit is that a lot of times it starts cashing out duelist emblems, strategist emblems, so you can play 4 duelists, 6 duelists, or more strategists. So just play accordingly what you cash out and just have fun collecting infinite value. Let's go over some of the new compositions that are in the lower tier and explain when you can play them. The first is Fan Service Xayah Rakan. This composition is something that recently got changed with the power-ups, where if you have one unit with Fan Service, you are guaranteed for the other to also get Fan Service. And they also increase the weighting of it. So a lot of times with the early game is you look to see if you have like a bow opener and a Xayah, put the fruit on Xayah. If you see Fan Service, keep that Xayah. Then when you find Rakan and you get the second fruit, you are guaranteed to hit Fan Service too. Fan Service is strong because it scales off a star level, but it's also kind of weak early. So if you have Rakan 1, Xayah 1, it's 300 HP, which is okay, but 2 stars, 600 HP, 30 resistances, which is kind of nice, and then 945, now you're talking, right? That's like Colossus territory of just like adding a lot of stats to Rakan. And the 45 AD and 45 attack speed is really good for Xayah. Best in slot Xayah is Rageblade, Kraken, and another item. A lot of times people go Giant Slayer. It seems to do the best, but you can also go for Gunblade, another Kraken, an Edge of Night. Same build as Ashe, basically. But the Giant Slayer just helps her take down tanks because she is solo carrying. Rakan is actually a really interesting item mix here because the data suggests that Archangels is quite good on Rakan because it just scales his healing, and he actually can also be the dual carry. So this is an experimental build, so your mileage may vary, but according to the stats, Rakan's best in slot is Stoneplate, Archangels, and Titans. But the problem with Titans is that it requires yet another bow. So If you can't get Titans, you probably just go for a Bramble, a Dragon's Claw, just some kind of defensive item. But hey, I mean, we're trying to show you what is theoretically some of the best builds. You can definitely try to go for that. The big caveat to playing fan service is that if there are multiple Star Guardian players and multiple Yuumi players, Rakan and Xayah are just going to be taken out of the pool. So I don't think you can chase this if you see 3 Star Guardian players or 3 Yuumi players ever, because that just means you're just going to be so slow on hitting this unless you're crazy high rolling with a bunch of econ, or you're playing like a way to get duplicators so you can guarantee it even though you're contested. But it is a very cool comp if you can get it rolling, so definitely give it a shot if you are in a spot and you're playing around Xayah too. And Xayah is also one of the best openers for Star Guardian anyways, so in the worst case scenario, if you're contested on Xayah and you have fan service and you see someone else going fan service or you just don't think you can hit, you can always just pivot into Ashe or Star Guardians and you have the exact item setup anyways with the Stone Plate and the Rage Blade. Viego 3 reroll. This is actually a real comp, and I feel bad because I actually recommended Box to play this on one of his streams and he went super 8th, but I promise you that this comp is actually good if you can get to Viego 3. But Viego kind of suffers from the same problem as Xayah, which is if there are Ashe players in the lobby, like let's say there's 3 Ashe players, they're going to hold Viegos, and for the Xayah player, they're going to hold Xayahs. So it just becomes kind of difficult to actually get to this board. But Viego 3 got buffed this patch in particular, and he can be very, very solid. The other thing about Viego is that most people believe that it is strong with Soul Fighter and not necessarily duelists. If you play duelist Viego, you just kind of run into item issues, because let's say you're like, oh, well, this duelist version is broken. Why not just play Viego in this setup? It doesn't actually work really well because you can't really get Udyr set up and going on 7 without the Colossus, but then you're going to play 6 duelists and you're not going to get the Juggernaut on him, and you don't have the damage reduction to keep him super tanky. So it's actually much better with Soul Fighter. And then the second thing is Viego really wants range extension. Fishbones, Sniper's Focus are also really good. And I think the power-up of choice that people want is Stretchy Arms. Stretchy Arms seems to be really good for Viego to help him just stay safe, keep attacking, and doing a bunch of damage from range. If you do end up getting range, you probably don't need Edge of Night. Edge of Night is just to help keep Viego alive. If you have range, you probably don't need that anymore. And then you either power your tank, or in the late situations of the game, you can probably just put the power up on Gwen instead, which is totally fine. I do think that the board caps ultimately around 8 Soul Fighters. So if you do end up getting to like pushing levels like the 8 and 9, try to go for 8 Soul Fighter if you can. It's just, you know, a lot of extra power and stats, and it's definitely worth doing for Viego. Plus, you should just like, you know, overwhelm your opponents through just sheer value. Darius Reroll is actually a comp this set, but it's enabled specifically by one power-up, which is Fusion Dance. You want him to be played with 6 heavyweights, and you want him to absorb one big Chungus. And we're not talking about just like giving him Zac 2. We're talking about feeding him Jace 3 and giving that Jace sword-based items so that Fusion Dance can absorb that damage. It's very similar to the way that Hungry Crab was played back in set 13, the Anomaly set, where I believe you had Urgot eating the set, right? Very similar to that, where you power up Darius and just becomes unstoppable. Smolder is pretty flexible too. You don't actually have to play around Smolder 3. You can just actually have him be an item holder as well, just like applying anti-heal. But you also have flexibility, right? You can just pair with other different parts of the tree. You could play for Supreme Cell, for example, if you get Supreme +1. You can have Poppy mixed with Jinx. You can have Zac with snipers. You can even play, you know, the other mentors if you somehow find a way to high roll and get 6 heavyweight with all the mentors. The most important thing is that you roll for Darius 3 and you go for Jace 3 and you have him consume the Jace 3. Here's the issue though. You cannot play this comp if there is a single Xayah player in the lobby, because Xayah also wants the Darius. So if you're ever in the situation where you see another Xayah player in the lobby, you probably can't play it. And that's just kind of the name of the game for a lot of the B tier comps that we're going over. They're good. You just have to make sure you're not contested on these lines. They're very, very hard to hit. Definitely, if you see Rig Shop and you have sword items, it's something to think about. And also, because of the way you're slamming items, you might incidentally find yourself like, oh, I was thinking about Xayah, but I have so many Darius and I have reroll augments for Darius. Maybe I just play Darius instead. That is also okay. Just keep an eye out for this composition because it is so good if you can get to the spot. The last of the B tier comps that we're going to talk about is Mech. The specific power up that you're going to want is Mech Pilot 2. You want not just one person with the pilot mech, but specifically 2 Mech Pilot. And most commonly, what you end up playing is Lucian and Senna into the Mighty Mech. But the issue with this is that it's kind of rare to get it. You see, the weight is not actually the highest. Unlike something like fan service, you look at the weighting, it's just higher than usual, right? You see weight colon 15, weight colon 15. You're more likely to get those fruits, especially as the game goes on. But it's actually on the rarer side, and that's the big limiting factor that stops us from being able to play 7 mech this patch really consistently, is because you just can't hit it that often. If you do end up hitting it, though, one really common thing to do is to give it to Lucian and Senna, and then you give Senna something like Thieves' Gloves. When they go into the mech, they power up the mech does a really good job, and then Senna pops out and can do a little bit of damage. And they're trying to also have Yone hold the AD items and Karma hit the AP items. So there's a lot of conditions that need to be met, right? You really want to have all the power in the mech, and you really want to have items for Karma, and you really need to hit Yone, who's a 5 cost, but it's kind of hard to do that when you're at level 8 because, you know, how are you supposed to get there? So it's pretty tricky. Another thing about this mech is that I think these augments, like I'll be the head, legs, and arms, I mean, if you can hit it all, it wins the game, but they don't actually do that much unless you actually hit the prismatic of it. So just be mindful that it can be bait a lot of times. Oh, one thing to note, by the way, with Karma is that because she's not being played with sorcerers, you actually do want another AP source or Void Staff to shred for herself. So, you know, make sure you have Archangel or Death Cap or something for Karma instead of going for like the full crit build like we have in sorcerers. But yes, I want to emphasize this is a real comp, and it is pretty solid if you can get there. This was put on display at the Battle Academia Tournament Cup a few times, and it's pretty much just hit or miss with the power-ups. If you hit the power-ups, great. If you miss, you might be in trouble. For the first time in a while in these tier list videos, we are actually going to go into the C tier comps because C tier is actually pretty good this patch. Basically, in this set, there are so many situational comps that you can play. Like, in reality, this tier could be like 20 different comps. But it also feels kind of disingenuous because some comps are just pretty much like you're going to play like once the entire set on average. I think, for example, like All Out Cassante, if you play Cassante, like one of the power-ups you can get is like trying to turn into All Out and immediately attack. That build is basically dead. So it feels like disingenuous to put like every comp in C tier because then it'll just like bloat the entire tier list and you just too many options. So we cut out half the comps in C tier, and the ones that remain actually like situationally can pop off if the conditions are right. So just want to put that out there before we proceed. C tier does not mean unplayable, unlike they are in previous patches. Let's talk about this Volibear Jinx comp that's starting to surface. Basically, this is sort of like when you get bullied off of Ashe and Star Guardians, and you're in a situation where you're rolling down. You're trying to roll down for Poppy Jinx, for Star Guardian, or maybe you're trying to roll for like Duelists because you had Gnar as an opener with Ashe and trying to go for like the Udyr, and somehow you just can't really find it working, and you hit Volibear and you hit like Braum and this kind of stuff. This is basically like a backup option that you play for as a way to salvage placements. And this is actually something that picked up a lot of steam in EU and APAC during the Cup. And it was something that people played for like a lot of thirds. So it's something that I just want to put on people's radar because there is flexibility specifically around the Jinx line. So just keep that in mind. It's actually not that bad of a setup, but it's also really temporary. You're supposed to actually only play this for stage 4 and stage 5 and then get out of it and try to transition back into Star Guardians or play into Sniper Flex. This Jinx Flex line is ultimately where you want to land. Volibear holds the items for Varus, and you can put, you know, the rest of the items on Cassante and Poppy and ultimately kind of fuse what we're talking about with what makes Fast 9 Varus really good, as well as what all the tempo that you can get from the Volibear and that Jinx line. So it's kind of hard. This is actually one of the few flex lines. I do want to cover it in the full video about like how people are approaching it, but it's really situational. It's not something you're supposed to be playing very often. If you slam these items, you should be much more committed to Star Guardian Ashe on average, but just keep that in mind. Katarina Reroll is one of the big losers of Yuumi being so popular because you're just not going to hit Leona and Yuumi very often anymore. And Ryze is also more popular. So just all the units around Katarina are more contested. And it feels like she's kind of really gated by Radiant items. So I wouldn't really be playing Katarina unless I have some way to almost like guarantee powerful artifacts and Radiance. You know, if you have something like, you know, power up the augment where you can like get the next augment tier higher, or if it's prismatic party or something like that, maybe that's where you can start thinking about Katarina if you have a good start for her. But other than that, I wouldn't really be thinking about Kat. And also over 9,000 is still really important to her, so try to see if you can get that for her. Soul Fighter is mainly a emblem check. If you can get an emblem on it and put the emblem on the Volibear or Braum, very powerful. But outside of that, I think I would avoid this patch because Samira is just nerfed, and even though they bug fixed her, it just wasn't good enough to justify it. So Probably wouldn't play it on Soul Fighter, but it did do decently in a couple tournaments. So, you know, it's still not the worst. And if you're forced to play into Soul Fighter, it's okay. It's not terrible. Okay, it's a little bit terrible, but it's not the worst comp in the game, I think. Akali is mostly unplayable, but the reason why I bring it up is because she's actually pretty good with one specific instance, which is Dawn Core. I know a lot of people open a Dawn Core and they think Kog'Maw, but if you can't get there, Dawn Core on Akali actually unnerfs her. And I think this is an important note because Akali is one of the few 4-cost that actually can deal with Yuumi and the Ashe. Like she can get to the backline because of the way people position their front line, and you can actually just kill her. So I feel like it's worth calling out. I've played this 3 times, and I went first all 3 times with this, I think, or maybe second with one of them. But it's just because Akali really bullies like the 1-star Ashe and the 1-star Yuumi that are trying to, you know, narrowly get through stage 4 by hiding behind the front line. If you get Dawn Core Akali, she just absolutely murders them. So she can become the hero that, you know, maybe we don't deserve, but the one that we need during this meta of front to back stalling. And the last C tier comp that I want to go over that might be worth noting, and this one has the most potential out of all the C tier comps, but something that I don't think is very reliable, is Xayah Reroll. You play Colossal Xayah, you have him big stacked, and you get him to stall out for Lux, because Xayah is actually a pretty good tank. It's just that, I don't know, I just feel like it's really hard to get into this line, and trying to reroll Lux alongside with him can be pretty inconsistent. But if you can get Colossal and efficient for this combo, it can be really good. It's kind of silly because you look at the Xayah items, it's actually very similar to the Udyr for Ashe with the Stoneplay, Stairs Gauge, and Titan's Resolve. You could theoretically slam these items and look for like the Rage Blade and like, hey, I'm not finding any Ashe items. I find 5 people in the lobby playing it. What can I do? Maybe think about Xayah Lux. If you have, you know, Xayah 2, Lux 2, you got a bunch of econ and, you know, maybe just AP items and you have to go for it. So just something to think about. It's something that Solus and dishsoap talk about a lot and they approve it. I'm not so sure I'm convinced. But, you know, maybe there's actually something there. I have no clue. Over into the hero augments, there's only a few that I think are worth playing. The first is Perfect Form Zach. I think this is the best 1-cost hero augment, and the others are just generally very unreliable / trash. And it's because they buffed the top end of this, and it's very, very solid. And, of course, if you can make it to Varus, the composition is quite good. 6 Wraith does a ton of damage. Zach is also really good with Zhonya's and a couple of other artifacts. Like, I think Seeker's Arm Guard is surprisingly pretty good on him as well. So try to reroll Zach. He's really good with AP items and, you know, making sure that he has Jewel Gauntlet and Archangels, I think, are the most important. This last item, Hand of Justice, could be replaced by a handful of other things. You don't need to go for KO3. This is just like if you end up rolling for all the one costs while pushing levels, but you don't need KO3 at all. Knuckle Duster's Vi is probably going to have to replace its backline because Jhin 3 is going to be hard to hit, but you won't always have a sniper protector in the lobby. If you do, try to go for the Jhin 3 as the backline, but you don't have to in order to get the Vi online. You can play any backline. You can play Ashe. You can play Jinx as the sniper. You can also try to play the monster trainer like Smolder or something like that. So don't feel like you have to play around Jhin as your backliner, but Knuckle Duster's Vi is still pretty solid. And the last hero augment I want to talk about that I think is worth noting is Starfall Neeko. I actually think this one is pretty good now. If you get Crimson Veil onto Neeko and just ramp her with Archangels and Edge of Night, she kind of has like the same effect as Akali with like the Crimson Veil. She just becomes like impossible to kill and she just ramps up and just deals damage, which I guess is just like the whole theme of this entire patch. Just like, oh, Archangels or Rage Blade and just stall out the fight and just burst everything down. That's kind of what Neeko does. I think you want to play a 6 Protector version of it, though. I don't think you want to go Vertical Star Guardian because it's just too hard to hit the Seraphine while you're rolling on 7. And the 6 Protector on 7 is just much more reliable. So I would prefer to go for that. You also can play a couple of different variations. You can play Crit Neeko with like Jewel Gauntlet Hodge, or you can play Double Archangels. So don't feel like you have to commit to specifically this build. The backliner can just be versatile between Janna or someone else that you hit. You can also play around Seraphine as well. But either way, this Neeko is really, really solid, so don't sleep on it. The downside, of course, is if there are a lot of Star Guardian players in the lobby, it's going to be really hard to hit Neeko 3. Last but not least, we have Dr. Mundo's Hero Augment. Apparently, they buffed it again. I think this is the 3rd patch in a row they buffed it, and not completely useless. It's actually better than the other Hero Augments in the stats. However, you absolutely need Bis. You cannot play Mundo with anything besides these 3 items. I don't know why, but whenever I look at the stats, anything besides Rageblade, Infinity Edge, and Striker's Flail, it is just so much worse. If you have Rageblade, Infinity Edge, Gunblade, terrible. Infinity Edge, Rageblade, and Kraken, terrible. If you have Rageblade, Infinity Edge, and Giant Slayer, terrible. Just like everything besides specifically these 3 items, just completely useless. I'm not entirely sure if I'm missing something. Maybe there's an artifact or maybe some kind of augment, but it's bad. Like if you don't play it. However, if you do, it looks like it can be a pretty decent top 4 comp. And Mundo is not really contested very much. So maybe it's something to think about. Either way, give it a try if you're willing to throw away some LP and report back, because I definitely am not going to click this augment unless I have like 3 Bis components and like components to just finish it off, because I wouldn't play this unless I have like component hand builds or something. Just feels like too big of a risk. Overall, I think this patch is not too bad. Outside of like Yuumi and Ashe being a little bit too much about the ramp power, there's actually a pretty good amount of comps that you can play if you have the spots for it, with a big swath of like situational one-off rerolls that you can play. And just through the totality of like everything that's available in the meta, there's actually a lot that you can do. It's just that I think the top is just too oppressive. Like I think the Udyr 2 is too difficult to deal with, and I think Yuumi 1 does too much damage. If they just turn that down a little bit, and you know, they don't actually have to buff too much more. In fact, I actually think this patch would be really good as long as they like hadn't nerfed sorcerers and Samira. I think this patch actually would be pretty dang solid overall. So I actually think we're in a pretty decent spot balance wise, and I think we don't have to do too much moving forward in the patch, because I know that some of those top end things could be frustrating, but overall I think it's pretty solid stuff. That's it for this video. Make sure to like and subscribe on the channel, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.